is it inflationary when the Treasury issues Treasuries? So this is a very interesting question. So let's start with the basics. When the government issues a Treasury, this is deficit spending. So they are taking currency units from investor A, say the average Joe who wants to buy the Treasury. That those currency units are basically going to the government. I mean, not really. It gets technical with the TGA there on the Fed's balance sheet and whatnot. But let's just assume that these are green pieces of paper. The average Joe gives the green pieces of paper to Janet Yellen. She puts them in her back pocket, and then she issues the average Joe a treasury. Then Janet Yellen will take those green pieces of paper, and then she'll send them to ABC person, the average Jane, let's say, for a welfare program or whatever government spending. So once the currency units go from the average Joe to Janet Yellen, they are taken out of the circulation. Therefore, this would impact M2. It would decrease M2. But then when Janet Yellen spends those currency units back into the economy by giving them to the average Jane, then M2 would go up by the same amount that it went down when Joe bought the Treasury to begin with. And it's the exact same thing with taxes. But taxes are a little bit more, in fact, a lot more clear in the sense that unless you're changing the velocity, which gets technical there, because if you're taking money out, let's say taking M2 down, but you're taking very low velocity M2 down out of the economy, such as it's on like a pension fund's balance sheet or something, and then you're spending that out in stimulus checks, you still got the same M2, but you cranked up velocity there because you're taking it from a very low velocity source and you're giving it to individuals that will most likely spend it with high velocity. So this could impact inflation, which I think is definitely at the heart of your question. So now that we kind of understand those basics, where the government is sucking, let's see, currency units out of the economy, and then they're putting those same currency units right back into the economy. In this particular example, M2 has not changed, but we have to ask ourselves if there's any difference with the liquidity of a currency unit and a treasury, because this is where it gets really interesting and very complex, especially if you're trying to look at it through the lens of inflation probabilities moving forward. So let's say that treasury goes to the average Joe. He's most likely just going to keep it on his balance sheet, do nothing with it. He's not going to turn it into liquid cash. But let's just say that treasury goes onto the balance sheet of a hedge fund, that the hedge fund buys it from Janet Yellen. Okay, this is a non-bank entity. So that's taking currency units out of M2, putting it back in when she takes it from the hedge fund over to the average Jane. But now the hedge fund has I would argue a cash equivalent, because the hedge fund or the banking institution, fill in the blank, they can take that treasury and they don't have to sell it. They can just go right into repo and say, okay, give me the currency units. And another bank can create the currency units out of thin air to give to the hedge fund to go buy stocks. And whomever the hedge fund buys stocks from, then they have those currency units, those new currency units on their balance sheet. And therefore, M2 on net balance has increased as a result of the hedge fund having an asset that I would argue is just as liquid as the cash equivalent. So I think my answer would be it's possible and it depends. The degree to which it is inflationary depends on who is getting that treasury and how liquid is it based on the use case. So that average Joe, the use case, just sitting on his balance sheet, just parking it, do nothing. Where that hedge fund, their use case is probably buying those T-bills so they can use them as collateral and repo to go ahead and get currency units to buy stocks or what have you. So this is it seems like a very straightforward question, but when you start digging beneath the surface, as you can tell, there's quite a bit of nuance. And so I would say that, again, is it inflationary when the Treasury issues treasuries? It can be, and if it is, the degree to which it is inflationary depends on where those treasuries end up. Hopefully that makes sense. Great question.